Intake paperwork often defaults to vague, boilerplate forms that satisfy administrative checklists but offer zero clinical direction. Effective work requires moving past these templates to build a concrete, highly individualized roadmap that dictates what the client is working on, what success looks like, and how progress is measured. This sequence of interconnected nodes visualizes what clinicians call the golden thread of documentation. Care requires a logical progression of dependencies. An assessment identifies the core problems, a diagnostic summary synthesizes those findings, a treatment plan sets the goals, progress notes document the specific work toward those goals, and a discharge summary records the final outcome. The first two steps do not simply sit in a file. The raw data of the assessment and the clinical logic of the diagnostic summary must feed directly into the treatment plan. That central node uses those specific findings to set the actual trajectory of care.
When that sequence breaks, when a clinician writes progress notes that ignore the treatment plan or builds a plan that fails to connect to the initial assessment, the entire structure of care collapses. Treatment loses its direction, and the clinical rationale becomes legally and medically indefensible. The practical assembly of this map begins by distilling the raw findings of the assessment into a prioritized problem list. A counselor identifies specific issues in clear clinical language, such as daily alcohol use with morning withdrawal or unstable housing. Because no client can address every issue simultaneously, the clinician and client must triage this list together. This requires weighing immediate safety risks and clinical severity against the client's own stated priorities for their life. Safety always dictates the immediate response. But beyond immediate harm, a client terrified of imminent eviction will rarely engage with a plan that ignores their housing status to focus exclusively on their substance use disorder. A plan that bypasses the client's stated priorities to focus only on a counselor-driven agenda produces superficial compliance. Over time, it leads to clinical disengagement. Once the priorities are set, the clinician must draft the mechanics of the plan. A frequent clinical error at this stage is conflating goals, objectives, and interventions, treating them as interchangeable terms. Each serves a strictly defined mechanical function. Goals are broad statements of the desired final outcome. Phrases like establish stable housing or maintain abstinence are goals. They represent the final destination and are typically framed in the client's own language. Objectives are the specific, time-bound milestones required to move the client toward that broader goal. A single goal usually relies on several concrete objectives to bridge the distance between the client's current reality and their destination. Interventions are the explicit actions the clinician and the program will execute to help the client reach each milestone. Weekly cognitive behavioral therapy sessions, craving management techniques, and referrals to recovery housing are all interventions. Keeping these distinct prevents vague charting. Consider a week objective. The client will work on coping skills. It lacks a metric for success. A concrete alternative reads, the client will identify 3 personal relapse triggers and demonstrate a specific coping strategy for each, in session within 4 weeks. The standard for this level of precision is the SMART framework. Every drafted objective must be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Enforcing strict measurability protects both the client and the counselor. It makes progress entirely visible, supports honest clinical review, and creates an unambiguous, accountable record of the work actually being done. If an objective cannot be objectively measured, it cannot be evaluated. Without evaluation, the entire treatment plan is stripped of its accountability. A meticulously structured plan still fails if it doesn't fit the client. A functional treatment plan must calibrate to 2 specific dimensions of the client's reality simultaneously. First, the intensity of the interventions must match the client's assessed ASAM level of care. An outpatient client requires a different clinical structure and intervention intensity than a client in a residential program. Second, the behavioral expectations demanded by the objectives must match the client's current stage of change. Imposing action-oriented, abstinence-focused objectives on a client who is highly ambivalent often results in failure.
The plan demands behavior they haven't yet decided to exhibit.
For hesitant clients, early-stage objectives focus on engagement, building internal awareness, and utilizing motivational interviewing techniques to explore their ambivalence.
As the client's internal motivation shifts and they prepare for genuine action, the documented objectives escalate in complexity to match that new readiness. Beyond clinical acuity and motivation, the overarching plan must also account for practical realities, integrating with the client's basic literacy levels, daily schedule, and available community resources. Continuously matching the plan to the exact clinical and motivational coordinates of the client transforms the document into a realistic roadmap. To function effectively, this roadmap must map assets, not just pathology. An effective plan builds heavily on the client's inherent strengths, rather than functioning solely as an inventory of their deficits.
During the assessment phase, the clinician must actively mine for specific external and internal resources. A stable job, a supportive family member, a strong faith community, or prior periods of successful abstinence are critical raw materials. Deliberately integrating these assets into the plan's objectives increases the client's self-efficacy. It counters the demoralization that a purely problem-focused therapy model can reinforce. This requires the treatment planning process to operate as a genuine collaboration. The map is built with the client, not formulated in isolation and prescribed for them. The clinician provides the necessary expertise to sequence realistic action steps and select evidence-based interventions, but the client must maintain primary ownership of the final goals. The finished document is reviewed and signed by both parties. These signatures signify a clinical partnership while satisfying strict regulatory requirements for compliance. Because it serves as the central clinical record, the plan is locked beneath stringent confidentiality rules governed by HIPAA and 42 CFR Part 2, strictly limiting who can view the trajectory of care. These signatures and systemic privacy protections ensure the client views the plan as a secure, mutually owned trajectory of their own recovery. A common administrative misunderstanding in clinical care is the assumption that a treatment plan is a one-time form, completed strictly for intake compliance and then filed away in a chart. A treatment plan is a continuously evolving, living document. Because clients constantly change, the plan requires scheduled, systemic clinical reviews to remain accurate. Beyond scheduled intervals, unpredictable real-world catalysts demand immediate, out-of-cycle revisions. A sudden relapse, a housing crisis, or a major life change alters the clinical terrain, requiring a new map. Success dictates revision just as heavily as crisis. Achieving a major clinical goal is a trigger to immediately revise the document and establish the next phase of work. By building automated review points directly into the clinical timeline, the therapy recalculates around these events. Care remains responsive to the current reality rather than following an outdated map. A proper revision requires precise mechanical updates. The clinician must update the active problem list, officially retire objectives that have been met, and explicitly set the immediate next steps in the formal record. This discipline of continuous documentation maintains an unbroken clinical thread across the entire lifespan of the client's care, proving exactly what was addressed, when, and with what result. A treatment plan that is never revised is the clearest indicator that the clinical team has stopped responding to the client's actual reality. The final dimension of a successful plan is context. The document must act as a precise reflection of the client's unique cultural background, their localized values, and their specific preferences. Establishing goals that ignore a client's familial obligations or bypass their established spiritual practices creates a significant clinical risk. Objectives that remain disconnected from a client's specific cultural understanding of recovery will likely be rejected or ignored in practice. Formally incorporating culturally relevant resources, such as specific faith communities, culturally specific recovery groups, or culturally defined family structures, fortifies the resiliency of the plan. The clinician must architect the care trajectory with the client's highly specific ecosystem in mind, deliberately rejecting any abstract, one-size-fits-all methodology. When a treatment plan harmonizes clinical acuity, personal motivation, and cultural reality, it moves beyond a compliance requirement to become the organizing structure of the recovery process.